All right, everybody. I think we're going to get started with the webinar. I'm really excited to be hosting this introduction to tree seed collection with two really great people who have professional experience around tree seed collection, Richard Nesslar from Wisconsin and Kira Pollack from University of Minnesota Extension. So for our webinar today, I'm going to briefly introduce the speakers. We're going to go through some housekeeping for the webinar. Then we're quickly going to pass it off to Richard, who is going to speak for about 20 minutes. Afterwards, we'll pass it off to Kira, who will speak for another 20 minutes. We are going to hold a Q&A session for about 15 minutes, and we'll close out the webinar around 1. So for housekeeping, you'll notice that your microphone and cameras are turned off for this webinar to accommodate as many people as possible. Please do use the question and answer feature to ask questions in the webinar. I will look at those questions and I will be sure to ask them to our speakers. If you ask a question in chat, I will be monitoring the chat as well. And if you see the chat on your screen, please tell us where you're coming from. Tell us a fun fact, where your forest land is located, so we can get a discussion there. We are going to be launching some surveys. I'm quickly going to launch one, but at the end of the webinar, we also have an evaluation survey. These surveys are really important to us. They help us improve our programming, help us understand what we're getting right, and make our outreach and educational opportunities as best we can for you, our audience. So with that in mind, I'm going to quick launch our first poll here. So you will see this poll pop up onto your screen. This poll is completely optional for you to fill out. This is our demographic questionnaire. So Extension collects participation demographic information to better understand who we reach with our programming. This information helps us ensure that our programs and services are equitable and accessible to everyone. Collecting demographic data is also required to demonstrate our institutional compliance with non-discrimination laws and policies. So we'll give you just a few moments to do that poll. So I see a lot of folks are doing that. Thank you so much. As folks are working on that poll, I just want to indicate that you can connect with us at UW-Madison Forestry Extension. We have websites, we have newsletters. There's lots of different ways that you can access the materials you're seeing here and also explore some other materials that you may find of benefit for you for forest management. We will also have contact information for each of our speakers here later in the presentation. So I'm seeing our polls slow down. Thank you so much for that. And right now, I would like to pass it off to our first speaker, Richard. So Richard, as you load up, as you share your screen, do you have a fun forestry fact about yourself?
I do have a fun forestry fact. It would be that my favorite tree in the upper Midwest is a jack pine, and that my favorite tree in the lower Midwest is a willow oak. Had to put in a plug for our northern species. All right, is everyone seeing this okay?
Looks great.
All right, perfect. Well, yeah, I'm very excited to be here. My name is Richard Nesslar, and I'm a tree improvement specialist with the state of Wisconsin, specifically in the Department of Natural Resources. As part of my job, I administer the seed procurement program for the Wisconsin Nursery Program. And I'm going to show you guys why tree seed is so important, how to sell tree seed to the state of Wisconsin, and then I'm going to specifically focus on a species that is of great importance right now in the upper Midwest for seed collection, and that would be the red pine. All right, so why is seed collection important? There's going to be a number of reasons for that, but mainly it's to grow trees. Both Wisconsin and Minnesota have state nursery programs that are going to supply seedlings to private landowners, state lands, federal lands, county lands, and then other partnering lands. as well as supply seed for direct seeding projects. And those are when you use actual seed instead of seedlings to regenerate trees on a site. Wisconsin alone, within their state nursery program, produces and distributes 4 to 6 million trees annually. So you can see there's a pretty large need for tree seed, so we can grow all those and get those trees out on the landscape. And we cannot do that without the help of collectors like you. So the state of Wisconsin does have seed orchards throughout the state of Wisconsin. I think they cover around 120 acres, and I think we have about 25 of them. But we do not have the staff capacity, nor do those orchards have the capacity to meet all of the seed demands that we have for the nursery program within the state of Wisconsin. And the good part is that we offer money to do this. So you can see this table over here on the right. What this is a part of our seed collectors newsletter that we release annually. You can also find this on the Wisconsin DNR's external webpage. Just to kind of break it down a little bit, on the left, you have the species that we're collecting. So this is going to vary annually. And we'll talk about this a little later. You need to check ahead with us before collecting just to make sure we still need that species and then that it's ready. The column next to that to the right is going to be the estimated purchasing goal, and this is statewide. So again, this is why it is very important to contact us prior to picking. With very, very popular species to pick or species where we only need limited amounts, we'll oftentimes establish per picker quotas. Next to that is just the units. So we either measure things by volume, and that would be a bushel, or we measure weight of whatever seed is collected. Next to that's the part that most people pay attention to, and that's going to be the price per that unit that we are paying. And then all the way over to the right is going to be an approximate purchase date. And this is an estimate, and this varies by weather and from year to year. And this is going to be when you're normally safe to begin picking. But as I will reiterate later, please contact one of the Wisconsin nurseries prior to collecting seed just to make sure things are ready. All right, so how does the process work for getting seed to us at the state of Wisconsin within the reforestation team? The first and foremost is always going to be to contact us. This is especially true if you're new to seed collecting or collection, or if you're collecting an unfamiliar species. It's always going to be best to check with the experts. But even if you're a really experienced seed picker, you still need to reach out to us to make sure that we need the seed that you're trying to collect and to see if we need to establish a quota for that specific species. The next step of the process is going to be to find a collection location. So kind of hone down what species you were looking for. So maybe you know that there's a red pine plantation close by, or you know there's this really, really nice 200-year-old white oak tree that's in a park near where you live. So try to establish that and find that location and get where it would be easy to pick. But then the next and probably most important part is going to always be sure to get approval and or any required permits prior to collecting. And this is going to vary by property ownership. So for a Wisconsin example, if I were going to collect from the Sawyer County Forest, I would need to contact the Sawyer County Forestry Department to see where I can collect and to get a permit. Whereas if I wanted to collect seed from the Governor Knowles State Forest, I would reach out to their property manager to find out acceptable locations to collect as well as to get that permit. Once you have done that and you're sure that you have permission to collect on the land that you're going to, the next thing to do is to begin collecting. And one suggestion that I always make is that if something odd arises or you have any questions while collecting, reach out to one of the nurseries. So my phone, which the number will be listed later, takes pictures or receives text pictures. Send me a picture, say, hey, is this what you're looking for? Hey, is this ready yet? I would rather answer that question on the front end prior to you collecting a bunch of seed that we cannot accept. One other note that I would like to put in here is that we prefer to get seed from wild seed sources. So we don't want boulevard trees, cultivars planted in your yard or anything like that. Though those trees may be beautiful, they oftentimes are not genetically predisposed to performing well in wild locations. So we want those tree seed sources that are really suited to growing in these wild environments. Oh, the next and very important step is going to be to store cones or seed that you collect. You want to keep these cones and seed in a cool and dry location. If you do not, they're going to spoil. If you end up collecting things like berries or things like that, it's best to throw those in a refrigerator because if the seed is spoiled or if cones open up, we will not accept them here, at least in the state of Wisconsin. And your final step is going to be to deliver the seed to a buying station. Huge suggestion to bring these cones or other seed as soon as possible before it spoils. We have 14 buying stations located across Wisconsin, and those are going to be listed here. So the ones in bold are going to be our 3 state nurseries, and then we have 11 additional buying locations spread across the state of Wisconsin. All drop-offs are by appointment only, so be sure to contact the contact listed there per each buying station to make sure they're around. If you just show up, there's a good chance that one of these people won't be there to help you out because most of them are field foresters. Once you get to your buying station, we're going to measure your seed. Again, that's either going to be by the bushel or by the pound. And then we're going to have you fill out one of these seed purchase orders. And basically what this does is add up the amount of volume per species that you've collected, provide that value per species, total that dollar value up. And then what we need from you is basically just a printed name, an address where you would like that check mailed. And now we request a phone number just in case there's an issue getting that check to you, which seems to keep coming up. And it's just normally like errors in typing an address or something like that in. And then we need your signature. And again, the signature there is just certifying that the seed is from wild sources and from the location stated on the form. So you can see that seed collection county up there in the top right corner of this sheet. We try to track seed by location so we can match that seed source to the seedling source. And then once we put that out for sale, there are certain agencies and entities that would like to know that we are purchasing seedlings that are well suited to grow in Northeast Wisconsin or something similar to that. And then once we have all of that seed, what we do with it is we grow seedlings in our production nursery, which is in Boscobel, Wisconsin, and this would be the Wilson State Nursery. Again, we're going to be producing and distributing anywhere from 4 to 6 million seedlings annually. All right, now that we've kind of covered how to get seed to us, I would like to focus on a specific species, and that's going to be red pine. Red pine seed is highly sought after within the upper Midwest. Supplies are dwindling from a coupling of bad seed years over a decade or so, and then lack of pickers. So a lot of the pickers that we relied on for a long time have kind of aged out and are no longer collecting for us. So that's why we're trying to build this new cohort of seed collectors for us here in the state of Wisconsin and across Minnesota as well. So we know no borders. Red pine is a economically important species within the upper Midwest. I might put on the caveat that it may be the most important economic species within the upper Midwest. It's a great tree for commercial grade lumber production, as well as utility pole construction. A lot of times the red pine plantations and stuff that are located on land ownership types, that red pine plantation can pull in the value and make it so other portions of the property can still be economically feasible to manage from the value brought in from this red pine. It's also an important forest component of both past and present forests. It's going to grow on sandier soils, most likely in the upper portions of either state, so in your northern reaches. In Wisconsin, we sold 1.1 million seedlings of red pine in 2026. And we have a demand for an additional 1.4 million in 2027. So how much red pine seed is needed? And this is going to be a Wisconsin specific example, but right now, 1 bushel of cones of red pine yields approximately 0.4 pounds of clean seed. To meet demand annually, we need to plant 80 pounds of seed. And this means every year we need to collect 200 bushels of red pine seed so we can continue to meet demands for red pine. So red pine identification. Red pine is going to be a large tree. It can reach upwards of 100 feet in height and 30 to 40 inches in diameter. Trees of that size are more so going to be found in river bottoms and areas like that. If you're looking more in heavily managed plantations and places like that, it's going to be more 12 to 20 inch diameter and about 60 to 70 feet. It has an extraordinarily straight trunk, which makes it well suited to utility pole construction. And it has an open branching structure with groups of needles interspersed. When I was in college in tree ID, it was kind of described as looking at having a bunch of cheerleader pom-poms and stuff all throughout the canopy of this tree. The bark is going to be plated with deeper fissures. It's going to have a mix of gray and brown with red. So that's an important one to note. So that's where it's getting its name from. And this is going to help us separate it from another pine species that it commonly can be confused with. The bark is going to actually stay fairly consistent in appearance from young to old. Obviously, the plates are going to get larger when it gets older, and those fissures are going to get a bit deeper. But for the most part, it's always going to have that reddish tint on the bark. So needles, we're looking at 2 needles per fascicle, which is those little bundles. And this is how we describe like needle structure on pine species. You can see the needles on this picture here to the right. It's going to be the needles on the top. I also included 2 other pine species. One would be the eastern white pine, which is just below that, a little bit to the left, and then the jack pine, which is below that to the right. So red pine has longer needles, are going to be 4 to 6 inches long. That's how we're going to differentiate the red pine from the jack pine, because they do have the same number of needles per fascicle. But the red pine needles are going to be drastically longer. And then the needles are going to break cleanly when bent. And keep note of that for later, because that's going to push it apart from another species that it commonly gets confused with. All right, so non-native lookalikes of the red pine. The primary lookalike we're going to see over here on the left, and that's going to be the Austrian pine. One huge red flag is going to be it being found in urban settings. So if you're in Milwaukee, Madison, Minneapolis, Duluth, places like that, oftentimes you're going to see Austrian pine planted as a landscaping tree. So that should be red flag number 1. The next thing that separates it out from a red pine is going to be that the bark is gray to brown, and it is not going to have any of that red component within it. And then the final test that you can use is going to be to try to break those needles apart. So remember, the red pine needles, when you bend them, they easily break apart. With the Austrian pine, those needles are not going to break apart easily, and they'll stay attached even when bent all the way in half. The needle size is going to be extremely similar to red pine, and the tree form and structure and all that is also very similar to red pine, so they can be easily confused. The next lookalike that is non-native is going to be the Scotch pine. I actually think this is probably more easily confused with a jack pine, but I put in the presentation just for information purposes. The bark of a Scotch pine is going to be flaky, and it's going to contain bright orange areas, especially where the branches connect to the main trunk. The needles are going to be much shorter than a red pine, only measuring out to about 1 to 3 inches in length. Here I just have 2 cones next to each other. So on the left, we're going to have a red pine cone. Notice they're a little bit rounder, and they're going to be a little bit more symmetrical, and the tips do not come to a distinct point. On the right, you have an Austrian pine cone. The scales on that cone are a bit more angular and protrude outwards. And then you can see it's a little bit more slender, and that tip of the cone is going to come to a point. This is going to be a great situation to just send one of the nurseries a picture, though, or reach out to us, and we can help you piece out if you're looking at a red pine or an Austrian pine. We're here to help. We want you to be successful, and I don't want you to spend a bunch of time collecting things that we won't purchase. So next, once you've identified your red pine, when are the cones ready to collect? I have here on the left an immature red pine cone. You can see there the cone is still going to be bright green. And if cut open, the seeds inside are going to be lighter in color. And then if you press the actual meat of that seed there on the right, that's in front of the actual cone, you'd find that the inside is going to be really milky. So that seed's not developed and that seed will not grow a tree. So that is not something that we're looking for. On the right, we have mature red pine cones that are ready to pick. As you can see, that cone is darkened, so it's more of a purplish color, and this purplish color will eventually transition into a brown. But then again, if you cut that cone open, that seed coat is darkened, the wing on the seed is darkened, and if I press that seed against the piece of paper, the meat inside of the seed is going to be completely solid. We do not want open cones. So there's two primary reasons for this. The first is going to be that open cones are approximately twice the volume of closed cones. So we're losing money on our end there and not getting as much as we paid for. And then also that cone is opening and it's actually dropping all of its seed out. So the pine cone itself does not grow the tree. There's normally around 50 good seeds within a red pine cone. And when those cones open up on the tree inside the canopy, all those seeds with the little wings on them are going to disseminate out and around that tree. And that's actually what's growing your tree. Another thing to watch for is going to be pest damage cones. We've got two separate examples of pest damage on cones. On the left, we have pest damage where about half the cone dies. Don't let these trick you into thinking that the cone is ready. The discoloration is normally associated with some sort of insect boring hole or something along the lines of that. So if you see a bunch of these, try not to collect these and bring them in for us. Then over on the right, we just have tip rot on the cone there, and then a more extreme example of that cone rot where the entire cone died on the tree. So to kind of recap what a mature red pine cone is going to look like, we're looking for that color change from bright green to more of a purplish, transitioning into a brown. When you cut the cone open, the seed coat is darkened and the meat of the seed is going to be solid, not milky. In Wisconsin, we are normally going to begin taking cones that were harvested after September 1st. So we've done a bunch of timing studies and found that seeds collected after September 1st, for the most part, have a high germination rate. Those collected before this date are going to have a much lower germination rate. Always call and check us before collecting. And then it's an important thing to note, do not harvest a bunch of cones and store them prior to September 1st. So when a pine cone is cut and severed from a living tree, it no longer develops. So just because you waited until September 1st, you cut that cone 2 weeks prior, the seed inside there is not good and it is never going to fully develop. So please do not go harvest a bunch of cones and store them in your garage or something until after this date. And we're pretty good at telling that this has occurred too, because those cones are not going to darken in a normal fashion the way they normally would. So some of the best places to collect red pine cones from are also going to be places you're going to want to look for. And these are going to include young plantations that are producing cones, areas with open grown red pine trees. So more cone production occurs in full sunlight, and then there's going to be lower statured trees. Then you'll also want to look for recent timber harvests. Again, those trees need to be cut, have been cut after that September 1st deadline that we did. So the way cones or red pine cones are distributed through a tree is very, very randomly. They're not centered at the top, and they're oftentimes not going to be in those lower portions of the canopy. So you're looking for shorter, lower statured trees that are still producing cones. It is not the easiest tree to collect cones from. So yeah, just finding those more open grown trees and those younger plantations that still have full sunlight are going to be your best bet to collect from your wild trees that are still alive. And then again, if you're driving down the road and see a recent timber harvest or something like that in mid-September, also great locations because then all the cones and the branches are going to be located right along the ground. So you just bend over and pick them. So the next thing is, how do we collect a red pine cone? So we want to remove the cones from the branches at the base of the cone by clipping that cone where it meets said branch. For living trees, we want to be especially careful to minimize that branch damage. So you don't want to strip cones off that branch or do anything like that because you're actually damaging that tree and you're going to set it back and potentially reduce future cone production as well. Please do not cut off the entire branch either. Not only are you damaging and injuring that tree, but you're also removing next year's cones when you do this. So it takes 2 years for pine cones to develop. And so if you cut that cone or that branch off, what's happening there is you're removing next year's cones too. So there's going to be no cones next year to collect. And there's also going to be no cones to distribute that seed into that location in the future. When you're going into harvested areas where the branches are on the ground, we ask that you still please snip those cones and remove them from the branch. We only accept cones as part of the volume. Other debris and needles would need to be sorted out, and we would actually ask that you take your cones back and do that for us. We don't want to pay for dead volume. On the left is what I'm talking about there. You've got your hand pruners, great sharp ones that you use for gardening and other work around the house. And again, over here on the right, you're just clipping at the very base of that cone where it meets the branch, trying to make the cleanest cut that you possibly can. So what do we do with the seed? So the seed all comes up to where I work at the Hayward State Nursery. We process it into clean seed that can be put through a machine planter which you can see over there on the left. The conifer seed can be stored for upwards of 20 years and still be usable. This helps us go through boom bust cycles with cones, but we will store the seed, and then its final destination in Wisconsin is going to be the Wilson State Nursery, and in Minnesota is going to be the Badura State Nursery. And again, these seedlings are distributed to the public and public agencies and things like that for conservation purposes and conservation growing in both of the states. So that's all I had for you. Hopefully you learned a few things.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Richard. That was great. So now we will go on to Kira. Kira will lead us in their presentation. So Kira, as you get things loaded up, I'm going to stop my screen share. And would you like to tell us a fun forestry fact about yourself?
My fun forestry fact is that I got my start in forestry as a 5th grader growing up in Athens, Georgia. I joined the Clark County 4-H forestry judging team when I was, 10? And here I am, 2 decades later. Can you see my screen?
We can. It looks great.
Perfect. Let me make sure I can see my screen. Okie dokie. Well, good afternoon. As Keith mentioned, my name is Kira Pollack. I'm an extension educator focused on tree seed collection and production, and so I'm excited to talk to you a little bit about how things work here in Minnesota and also to talk about my focus tree. So we are at almost launch for a new iteration of our seed collection training course. I love acronyms, and so I call it CONES or CONES, which is a certified collector of nuts and seeds. The E's an ampersand. But generally speaking, it's the Minnesota Tree Seed Collector Training. You do not have to be in Minnesota to take the course. It will be pretty widely applicable to Wisconsin and a little bit beyond. So right now, the web page that you can access is z.umn.edu/treeseed. And then, I'm talking days, hopefully hours, until the website with the course is then published on that same site. If you scroll down, it's like training upcoming. Right now, we are focusing on 3 groups of trees. We're focusing on pines, spruces, and oaks. And as time passes, I will develop more and more materials. So online, lots of information, and then we will also have in-person training workshops around the state to get some hands-on experience and to meet with some Minnesota DNR folks and talk about what the process is for selling, because I'm not a DNR employee, so I know some of it, but not all of it. All right. My species that I'm focusing on is northern red oak, which is Quercus rubra. For people who love etymology, so how words got to be where they are, that Latin name, Quercus, is classical Latin for oaks, and it means beautiful tree, and rubra means red. So, fun fact, not Friday. It's important to go looking for red oak where you're probably going to find it, which luckily for us is most of both of our states. Don't you love motion sensor lights? I don't. It's commonly found in abundance in mesic sites, so like not swampy wet, but like a little damp, alongside species like sugar maple and basswood. It is moderately shade intolerant, so really it wants to be where it's sunny. It doesn't grow super well under dense canopies, and it's not super resilient to disturbance events like fire. It is worth noting that northern red oaks and other red oak species are more susceptible to oak wilt fungus due to a lack of defense structures. More fun facts, because I'm a nerd. These structures are called tyloses, and this is also why red oaks don't make good barrels, because they don't shut their vessels, whereas white oaks do. They shut their vessels, they make good barrels, and are more resilient and resistant to oak wilt. I also wanted to bring this up because there are currently no concerns that we're going to spread oak wilt through seed collection activities, at least through the seeds themselves. So if you are out and about, there are 2 different ways that you might see red oak present itself. When it is open grown, meaning it's kind of in a park or a residential site, there's nothing super close by, it's going to grow outward, and it has a very broad and rounded canopy that begins pretty low on the trunk. And because, as I mentioned earlier, it's moderately shade intolerant, if it's bunched up with a bunch of other trees, it's going to grow straight up because it wants sun. So in that case, in the picture to the right, you can see that it's really tall, and the canopy is now a little more elliptical, so like a really tall oval as opposed to a really long oval. It's moderately long-lived, and it can reach about 300 years in a really good site. It's also one of our faster-growing oaks. The bark is pretty noticeable, so it has pretty dark gray or dark gray-brown bark, and the pattern has long vertical ridges with flat tops and shallow fissures, and the fissures are that in-between spot. What I think is super neat is that northern red oak has red-orange fissures, so if you look in the picture on the far left, it's pretty gray, but you can see kind of stripes of orange in between. The oak leaves look oaky, and I know that's not super helpful, but we'll get into it. It has that classic lobes, which are the outy bits, and the sinuses, which are the innies. About 7 to 9 jagged lobes, and they have bristle tips, which is common, or like pretty characteristic of our red oak species. The sinuses are rounded in a narrow U, or I guess a round V shape. And if you flipped the leaf over and looked in the armpits of the veins, right where they branch out from the midrib, you'd see patches of hair called axillary tufts. The leaves are dark green in the summer and vibrantly red in the fall, also part of their name. And they generally do retain the leaves over winter, so you'll notice that unfortunately they don't stay that beautiful red all year. They stay on the tree and they turn brown. Northern red oaks have ovoid or egg-shaped acorns, and they have a smooth, shallow cap. So unlike our other oaks, and the caps that cover about a third or more of the nut, these sit right on top. My dendrology professor likened it to a beret called the acorn pierre. And they have a 2-year acorn development cycle, really similar to the red pines that we just talked about. So when you're scouting, you could see this year's acorns and next year's little baby acorns, which are super, super cute. They typically ripen mid-August through September, so we're really starting to see them right now. Like other oaks, northern red oak produces large crops every 2 to 5 years, which is called masting, and they do that to outwit the critters. So the most common misidentification for northern red oak is northern pin oak, which is made more complicated because they can hybridize. So to distinguish between the two, we're going to look at the bark, leaves, and acorns. So northern red oak, which again is the first picture, so the one on the left, has longer uninterrupted ridges, and northern pin oak bark is broken into smaller, blockier ridges. The leaves are a little bit easier. Northern red oaks have shallower sinuses, so the innies don't go quite as deep into the midrib. And so they make, again, that kind of rounded V or narrow U shape. Whereas northern pin oaks have deeper and a little bit wider sinuses, and they go almost all the way to the midrib, and they make more of a C shape. Northern pin oaks also generally have fewer lobes. So you can see in this side by side, there are kind of 5 really prominent, but like 7 lobes. And then northern red has more. I think it's probably easiest to tell the acorns apart, which is really good because you're all here because you're interested in seed collection. So northern red oak acorns are pretty round, and they're about 1 inch long and look like a juicy grape with a beret. Northern pin oaks, on the other hand, are smaller, at maybe 1/2 inch. They are narrower, and they tend to have a striped pattern along the side of the acorn. And the caps cover more of the acorn, so it's about somewhere between 1/3 and 1/2 of the acorn has the cap, and the scales go all the way up, not just the cap, but the peduncle, which is the part of the kind of the stem that connects the cap to the branch. So these look a little bit more like a hat. I guess a beret is a type of hat anyway. So when are northern red oak acorns ready to collect? So they're typically getting ripe mid-September or end of August to mid-October. Really, the color changes from green to red to brown. So we want to collect them when they're brown. And then ripe acorns are separating in 2 different ways. So the acorn cap is releasing from the branch, and the acorn itself is releasing from the cap. And so we want to make sure that we are collecting acorns without caps. We also do cut tests, and we want to see and make sure that the inside of the acorn has that beautiful kind of white, yellow, creamy colored embryo that fills the entire pericarp, the shell. And obviously we want to make sure that we're paying attention because all of this can happen relatively overnight, and so we want to keep track of what's happening on a regular basis. So I also wanted to compare this against some of our other oak species. So now's the time for basically all of our species except for swamp white oaks, which develop a little bit later, and then both bur and swamp white oaks can go into November. Collection for oak acorns is a little bit easier than pine because ripe acorns come to you. So we don't want to collect from the tree because if we are, those acorns probably aren't ready. So we are going to gather them off the ground using rakes or brooms, or you can use your hands or other tools. There are tools called nut rollers. There's a brand called Nut Wizard. They look a little bit like bingo. What are those called? cages, but with a long handle, and you can roll them up and then they collect acorns, a lot like a tennis ball picker-upper. If you are going to be on the ground, a lot of people find it really helpful to have knee pads because your body is really important, and it's a lot easier to replace an acorn than it is to replace your knees. You do want to make sure that you're collecting the appropriate data for your collection, and so you should also call ahead to whoever it is that you're selling to, whether that's Wisconsin or Minnesota DNRs or other nurseries or groups like the Farm and Forest Growers Cooperative, because all of them will have slightly different requirements for what information they need about where you collected, from how many trees, etc. You do need to process your acorns, and this is primarily done with a float test. So you probably wouldn't want to do it in a tub. My coworker who took this picture mentioned that there was a fair amount of weevil larvae and some tannin staining in their tub after this happened, but you can use a bucket. So make it real easy for yourself with very little cleanup afterwards. Fill your bucket with some acorns, and then the rest of the way with water. Wait a couple of hours, and then anything that's floating is probably underdeveloped or rotten. So you skim those off, and then you keep what has sunk. You will want to keep these in a cool place until you deliver them. And then acorns are a little bit different than pine cones because we do want them to retain some moisture. These are what's called recalcitrant seeds. And if they dry out, they die because seeds are living things. And then when you're selling them, I have a couple options side by side, just so you can make your own decisions whether you're doing it for the money or the glory or both. Minnesota DNR will pay $60 a bushel. The Farm and Forest Growers Cooperative is buying by the gallon. They're only collecting seed from the southern half of Minnesota and some of Wisconsin, and then Wisconsin pays $50 a bushel. As Richard mentioned, always call first. Save yourself some trouble. And that's what I have for y'all.
Excellent. Thank you so much, y'all. So now we are going to transition into our Q&A. So if you see that Q&A button on the screen, please do type your questions there. I will also be monitoring the chat, so if you cannot find that Q&A, please do type questions into the chat. As I said before, we are going to launch a survey just for you to give some feedback on how we did today. So I am going to drop this survey in the chat. We will also be sending this survey out with our recorded webinar from today. So you'll have an opportunity to see that survey. So please, if you can, refer to that Google form. My apologies. Let me get you the right link. There we go. So now that Google form is in the chat, and we can start taking your questions. I am going to share my screen just to have the contact information for both Richard and Kira while we go through the Q&A. All right, we are off to the races. So we have a question here. What is the price of bur oak and chestnut oak per bushel?
So I provided a link to our seed collectors newsletter there in the chat, and it's going to vary by state. So for Wisconsin, we are paying, I should know this off the top of my head, $40 a bushel for bur oak. Chestnut oak is not going to be a species that we collect in Wisconsin. We only grow species that commonly grow within Wisconsin or commonly planted. So chestnut oak is not one that we would collect, but Kira may have additional information on Minnesota.
I don't have information, unfortunately. We also do not collect chestnut oak. And I know that there's interest in bur oak, but it is not listed on the website where I can find it. So email the nursery. And Keith, we're going to need you to. Richard's link only went to us as panelists, so we can't share with
Gotcha.
the general everyone.
Gotcha. I will get that link to you. So does the state of Minnesota have bag nut machines available to the public?
The state doesn't, but there are a couple of county soil and water conservation districts that are starting to kind of build kits, basically. So, like, go out and collect seed. You can rent kind of all the materials you need. Hubbard County for sure does. I believe Isanti County is hoping to get one or two kits. It's one of those, oh wow, that's a great idea. We should do that. So it's slowly starting to expand.
Excellent. So I like this question. Why does tamarack seed have such a high purchase price? Is it due to low availability or difficulty in harvesting?
Oh, I can answer that because that was one of our primary species of focus this year, and we've been getting a decent amount of it in. Tamarack has a high purchase price because the cones are absolutely tiny, and it takes a day or more to collect even a bushel of for it. So when we establish seed prices, we try to get it all in a sweet spot where if you're collecting jack pine or red pine or tamarack, you're getting about the same money per unit of time that you're putting in. So yes, tamarack cones are, I don't know, an inch by an inch. So they're very small and similar to red pine, they are dispersed pretty randomly throughout the tree. So there's no focus area or anything like that. So extremely difficult to collect.
Typically, you also have to cut down tamarack in order to collect the cones off of the tree. That's what's called destructive harvest. Which, to be clear, a lot of foresters and managers know that that's what needs to happen. But that is one of the things when you are figuring out where you can collect, is that you should probably let them know, hey, I want to collect tamarack. Do you have any trees that I can cut down? And I've talked to some county land managers who are like, we'll tell people. They just need to call us. We don't have time, but they do.
Awesome. So I got a question here that I think has some really good clarification points. So I'm just going to read some of these here. So does Wisconsin collect Minnesota species?
We both have fairly similar species. I don't think that there's going to be much that's not overlapped just because we both occur in the Midwest or upper Midwest. There might be a few that Wisconsin collects that Minnesota doesn't, and vice versa. And then year to year, that's also going to vary because, again, we only purchase seed for species that we plan to grow and distribute, and Minnesota is going to operate the same way. So we're not just buying tree seed just to have it. We have numbers and we know what we need to grow and meet demand for the public.
And there's some specifications within seed zones. So trees and the climate don't know our political borders. And so there is also, not to mention the species overlap, but there's a lot of climate overlap between the two states. And so there can also be some trading, but it's not a one-to-one. If you collect in super northwest Minnesota, Wisconsin might not want it because the climates are different, if that makes sense.
And I think for me, it would be helpful to visualize what exactly is bushel. So if we think about, like a gallon bucket of acorns, how much is a bushel roughly?
The easiest way for me to visualize it is it's slightly less than 2 5-gallon buckets. Yeah. So if you collect 2 5-gallon buckets, you have a little over a bushel.
I know that Jeremiah Auer, who is one of your Wisconsin coworkers, is on this call. And the first time he described it to me, he was like, a gallon ice cream pail, a little over 9 of those. And I was like, okay, that's a lot of ice cream pails. So I do like the 5-gallon bucket better. Sorry, Jeremiah.
Let's see. Richard, could you reshare the nurseries that you had listed with potential interested purchasers? Maybe just dropping that link one more time in the chat if you would.
I can do
And
that.
perfect. As Richard does that, we got a good question here. How are trees surveyed throughout the state to determine what is needed? Also, what goes into the determination of how many of each kind of tree is best?
Um, so being that I'm a member of the Wisconsin Reforestation team, I have a pretty good idea and explanation for this. So we store tree seed. Not every tree can have seed stored. So like oak acorns, for instance, do not store well. So those basically we get our what we need to grow in the nurseries and plant that. But what we purchase is based on two main factors. The first is going to be tree seed that we have in storage, minus what we're going to be planting this year. And then the next is going to be species projections. So all of the foresters in the state provide us with projections on lands that they manage. So that's county forests, national forests, and then private lands foresters also provide us with projections. So we have a pretty good idea of what the demand is. We don't want to plant more seedlings because once a seedling gets too large in a nursery bed, it's no longer able to be used for planting when it's outplanted. And then we don't want to plant too few because then there's not going to be enough available. There's a lot of estimation and work that goes behind that, but we do a pretty good job. And that's where we're basing what we're purchasing on. So it's demand from the public, and that's given to us annually. And then again, minus what we have in storage. But hickory nuts, oak acorns, hazelnuts, things like that don't store very well. So we buy those every year that there's a good seed source.
Awesome. I wanted to ask a question. So for landowners who may be interested, maybe there's landowners who want to collect seed to plant on their property. How would that work? Would there be issues if we're out on a public area? Would you suggest that those landowners collect seed from their woodland property?
It depends. Um, Generally, so again, we want wild sourced seed, not planted. Though if it's planted over 100 years ago, it's very likely that it was that tree itself came from a local seed source, as opposed to nowadays where we can get it from anywhere, thanks Etsy and the proliferation of globalization. But public land and private land are both good. We just need, yeah, wild source permission, which is easier on private land. And we need enough parent trees. So ideally, like 10 plus. And that's just going to make sure that we have good genetic diversity so that we are not planting many millions of trees over several years that are all originating from one tree in one county somewhere.
That final point was a good one. That's why we oftentimes establish picker quotas because I know that there's some people that probably could meet the entire demand for the state from one picker, but we don't want it all from that person because they're likely picking from the same tree. So that's why we're trying to spread this out geographically and then amongst people because they're probably going to be picking from different trees. But yeah, we want those trees well suited and diverse to meet present and future growing conditions.
Excellent. So we still have time, about 5 more minutes for you to drop in any questions that you have to our presenters. I'll ask this one. What are the inherent wildlife or ecological values of red oak and red pine, just in review?
Food. Red oak is a great species for all sorts of critters. I mean, we think of our more charismatic mammals, but obviously insects, fungi, are all going to benefit. A lot of people want to plant these species for many reasons. They're both great for hunters because they do offer food and what is that called? Shelter.
Yeah, I can cover red pine because I think sometimes it gets a fairly bad rap as a wildlife species, but at one point it was a very, very important component of forests, and that's part of European settlement and all that. Red pine also is a good food source. Think about the red squirrels and stuff that are up in your trees eating the little pine seeds. Birds and stuff also are going to eat those. There's crossbill birds that specifically have bill designs so that they can open up the scales on a pine cone and feed on those seeds. They're also great habitat trees for things like roosting turkeys and stuff like that. And then outside of the plantation setting that we're used to seeing them in now, they would have grown as large sentinel pine species that would have been in barren habitat and stuff like that in the sandy regions of Wisconsin and Minnesota. So they're not just plantation species. They would have been very important components of those ecosystems too for perches and stuff for raptors and other things. So yeah, both species are going to be heavily important components of our forests within the upper Midwest.
Thank you, Derek. Yes, I was looking for thermal cover.
Excellent. So as another reminder, we're going to start to close down the webinar here today. Now that I see that our discussions are slowing down, please do fill out that Google form that is in the chat. And we really just appreciate everybody being on the call today. Really great presentations from you both. And yeah, thank you so much for sharing your expertise around tree seed collection. I know that for myself, this has gotten me really excited to be thinking about red pine, red oak in the system. So I'm really excited to go even scout out some of the areas that I know for these seeds. So I might be in contact with you both.
Yes.
All right, everybody. If that's, well, I guess Kira and Richard, do you have any last parting words for us?
Just thank you so much for joining, and I'm happy we're establishing these great partnerships between our states. I would actually like to put a plug in for Minnesota. I'm currently at the Badura State Nursery utilizing their seed extractory after we lost ours in Wisconsin last year in a fire. So partnership building is super important, and it's awesome to work with everybody at all of these awesome agencies.
I'll wrap up with seed collection is fun, and you don't have to be an expert to start. I have learned so much by going out and doing the thing and asking lots of questions. So if you have an opportunity to come to any of the in-person workshops or hop on a phone call with any of us, just start.
Awesome. I love it. Well, thank you, everybody, and have a great rest of your day.